On the 15th of May, 1948, the Arab League stormed into the hour-old nation of Israel amidst a barrage of shells and bullets. The newborn state awoke the next morning to find itself under attack on all three sides with the ocean to its back, and a deadly political knot of problems began unfolding in the Middle East. On August 15, 1929, Arab and Jewish mobs clashed in Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safed over Zionist flags on the Wailing Wall. During a week of communal violence to follow, 133 Jews and 115 Arabs would be killed and many wounded. It was a part of a controversial conflict lasting to this very day with no end in sight. Ralph Bunche, one of the few UN experts on mandates to colonialism of the time, was tasked to bring this conflict to an end. Despite many initial setbacks and several failed drafts with the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, Ralph Bunche steered Israel and the Arab League to a breakthrough compromise, lending both the UN and Israel international recognition. However, the peace was short-lived. The combatants refused to build on their Armistice agreement, and the region degenerated into conflict again several years after Bunche's attempt to bring about stability. The Arabs and Jews of Palestine have had a long history of ethnic tension, stretching back to even before the British occupied the region in 1917. The rise of Zionism and the horrors of World War II had led to mass Jewish immigration to Palestine. The Arabs openly displayed hostility towards what they saw as unwanted encroachment, and the Israeli immigrants' non-local ethnicity and differing religious backgrounds only exacerbated the problem.
For most of the 1940s, the Zionist side would have been much happier for the British to leave because the British had passed a white paper in 1939 drastically restricting Jewish immigration at really the worst possible time to restrict Jewish immigration.
By 1947, Palestinian and Arab attacks against the British administration forced the colonial government to give up responsibility to the newly founded United Nations. It was the first important mission tasked to the UN, and it responded by creating the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, or UNSCOP for short. Made up of Ralph Bunche and representatives from various countries, they went to Palestine to investigate the situation on the ground. Bunche acted as the representative from the Secretary General and had to write a majority report on behalf of the Commission. Finally, on November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly approved of an uneasy compromise creating two separate Arab and Jewish states in Palestine and the international city of Jerusalem, all linked by an economic union. It appeared that the issue was settled. Newly recognized Israeli peoples came out to dance in the streets, and the Jewish quickly set about to organize a provisional government. However, the conflict had only just started. The Arabs met the UN's resolution with deep hatred and rejected it. A three-day strike preceded calls for a holy war. The Arabs would refuse to organize their state. The matter was clear, there would be no compromise. On May 14, 1948, the last British troops left Palestine, an event well celebrated by the Israelis. However, the new state awoke to find itself under attack by an Arab coalition of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia with the ocean to its back. The UNSCOP compromise had failed and actually led to more conflict. A new solution was desperately needed to bring back peace to Southwest Asia. 8 months later, both sides were worn out from the war. The Israelis had fought valiantly and even pushed back the Arab forces. The Arab armies were divided and ran low on munitions due to a British embargo.
It will seem really miraculous that Israel won this victory against Egypt and Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Iraq, unless you look and Iraq only sent 500 soldiers and they all had weapons from 1912, and Jordan, the king of Jordan, kind of changed his mind about whether there should really be a war. So it was really Israel versus Egypt.
Israel also became deeply entrenched in American loans, and with them came increased international pressure for meaningful actions towards peace. By January 6, 1949, both Egypt and Israel accepted Bunche and the Security Council's proposal for an armistice negotiation under the UN. The talks would be supervised by Folke Bernadotte, who was appointed as the UN mediator just 4 days after the war began on May 10th. Since Bernadotte had limited knowledge of the region, Ralph Bunche became his right-hand man. The pair often worked hand in hand, first establishing a ceasefire and then drawing up a plan for a final settlement. However, Bernadotte's end came when he was assassinated in the September of 1948.
The mindset of the Lehi was that Europeans were not welcome in the land of Israel at that time, right? The Jewish people had just been subject to genocide in Europe. The Nazis did not have to completely force every country that they came to help them with their project of persecution of the Jews. In some places, like Romania and Hungary, they found authorities that were more than willing to cooperate with them in terms of rounding up Jews and sending them to ghettos and sending them to concentration camps. So from the perspective of the Lehi, they just weren't drawing distinctions between European authority figures at that point. And so here you have someone who, from their perspective, is attempting to persuade them to give up what they now feel is their right, which is the land of Israel. And I think they perceived that this would be an extremely effective targeted assassination because it would derail this process and it would prevent a peace agreement from coming about because they didn't want there to be a peace agreement. And I think you'll find this actually is a pattern that somewhat repeats throughout the later history of Israel and Palestine.
Bunche would have to continue on. He was appointed by the Security Council later that month as acting UN mediator in Palestine. The extent of his troubles were apparent right away, as the Egyptians still had not recognized a newborn Jewish state. The delegates from either respective country were in no amicable mood towards the other when they first met. 1949. Bunche took special care to foster a friendly climate. The hotel that the delegates were staying in had recreational facilities where parties could mix and mingle informally. After dinner, he would assemble teams for a three-sided snooker game with drinks around a table and slowly diffuse the tension. In the atmosphere of friendliness, direct negotiations and discussions could finally take place. They showed us that the Egyptians were human like us, with similar emotions of pleasure when they were winning and of dismay when they were losing, and I hope and believe that the Egyptians observed the same human qualities in us. The negotiations proceeded slowly, with each delegation considering and rejecting draft after draft, forcing the UN to repropose different solutions again and again. Territory-wise, both sides were unwilling to meet halfway in the desert region of Negev, located in southern Palestine and containing a few successful Israeli settlements. Both sides wanted Bunche to convince the other. At such an impasse, Bunche could be found drafting and mapping late into the night. Finally, on the 23rd of February, 1949, a compromise had been agreed upon after 2 long months of intense negotiations. Within a year after the Egyptian signing, armistice agreements were signed with Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. However, the armistice turned out to be far from what the UN hoped to be a long-lasting, stable peace. Bunche had intended the armistices to be quickly followed up by full settlements, which never came to fruition under the Palestine Conciliation Commission. The friendly, productive environment soon fell apart, and Egypt started an economic embargo against Israel a few months later, revealing that their true stance towards Israel remained unchanged. There was no true desire to achieve peace, and the Egyptians only wanted to recuperate after facing heavy losses in their previous invasion. Starved for goods, the Israelis had no choice but to attack Egypt, who had already stationed troops at the border, and Palestine retrogressed back into conflict. However, the treaty, while unsuccessful, did strengthen Israel's position in the international arena. The successful mediation also gave the still young United Nations a large publicity boost, establishing itself as a formal, non-partial overseer of the world, and saving itself from the fate of the League of Nations. On the morning of December 10, 1949, Bunche was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. However, the UN wasn't done with Bunche. He would later help with the decolonization of Africa until 1955, when he was appointed Undersecretary General, a position that would bring him around the world, from Cyprus to the Congo, and then even back to the Middle East. The failure to buttress the progress made by Bunche shows that even the most comprehensive of compromises are not enough if the parties are unwilling. The reluctance of both parties to compromise has led to a conflict lasting to this day. In this case, the failure to compromise and reach a peaceful conclusion to the first Arab-Israeli conflict has displaced more than 700,000 Palestinian refugees. While Bunche's first attempts to achieve a solution with UNSCOP brought more conflict into the region, his patient mediation of the Arab-Israeli conflict remains one of the toughest and most important compromises in the 20th century. His method has pioneered a formula for compromise and peace used in the UN to this very day.